So, you know how sometimes you have characters on TV shows and movies that just end up getting recast for some reason, or
hmm
they change. Doesn't it kind of drive you crazy when they don't even call it out in the show? Like they do that and then
Yeah.
like they just pretend like nothing happened at all. It's
It just insults the intelligence of the audience, really. It's a terrible practice. There's a huge trend of it in UK soap operas where like preteen kids would go to summer camp or something, and then when they would come back, they would be 18-year-olds with washboard abs. It was
oh,
really strange.
nice. No, everyone loves a good washboard ab.
Oh,
I
yeah.
mean, but it's kind of inappropriate when you're talking about a 16-year-old, I think.
Well, yes, definitely.
I was thinking like Darren on Bewitched or, even like Becky on Roseanne, although that
Right.
last reference is a little um
Yeah.
anyway, hi
Yes.
Conrad.
Hello, Melinda.
How's it going?
Not too bad. How are you?
I'm doing so amazing. Welcome everyone to the Dreamland podcast. My name is Melinda.
My name is Conrad.
And today's show is titled Hi. Not
Mm,
hi like hello, but hi with a GH. And
yeah.
while that could refer to illicit substances, affairs in the air, or even the short lived CBS show High Mountain Rangers, which one person posited, what we will actually be talking about today is TV shows depicting junior high school aged kids. So we're talking
Yes.
about like your 13 to 15-year-old kids. Though there may be some spillover into some older teen substance stuff. So, speaking of teenagers on TV shows, did you ever notice how teens on TV are often like played by 27-year-olds and how that's
They-
kind of creepy and weird?
it is creepy and weird, and it was especially prevalent in the 90s, I think.
They also never seem to deal with anything an actual teenager would deal with. It's more like
Mm.
something a 20-year-old would deal with. But anyway, um, I thought that it might be interesting to kind of delve into some of these shows and their origins because it really impacts a lot of modern television and even film today. So, to start off, I've done a little background. So, we're going to go back in time a little bit to the beginning of the turn of the 20th century. So, many, many years ago now. Um, Before then, you were like essentially you were a child and then you were an adult. There wasn't the concept of being a teenager. And um, before that time, like defining traits as teenagers, like no one just understood what it even was. Then in 1945, so right after the war, we came up with the Teenage Bill of Rights. Um, in the New York Times. This was a published article in the New York Times, and it was the birth of teen as a concept, not necessarily the use of the term, but the concept, right? And then teens suddenly started having a lot more freedom, yet they lacked full personal autonomy. So a lot of that came about because you had compulsory education, at least in the United States. I'm not as familiar with how you guys do it over in the UK, but between 1920 and 1936, the share of teenagers in high school more than doubled from about 30% to more than 60%.
Oh,
And
wow.
as young people started to spend time in school, of course, they get into their little cliques and they start talking and organizing and having common interests and complaining about parents and all that kind of stuff. So they got their own customs and they enforced their own social rules. And so that helped really define what a teenager was. And then you also had, the post war economic boom and the invention of the car sort of also played key roles in all of that. So, this group has its own unique set of challenges when you're talking about people this age because they start thinking and feeling like adults, but they don't have some of the key like parts of their brain formed yet, particularly the pleasure center of their brain is enlarged, and so like they have short term, like they're thinking of the short term impact of all of their decisions, so they're very at high risk for making some really bad decisions. um So starting in the 50s, but really moving into the 60s, we started seeing teens represented on TV shows, usually through school themed TV shows. And so you had things like a lot of them were actually over in the UK. So you had Billy Bunter of Greyfriars School,
Oh yeah.
Mr. Novak, This Man Craig, which was a great BBC Scotland show, which unfortunately, like Doctor Who, only very few, I think 2 out of the 52 episodes are even known to exist. You had the show
Yeah.
Please Sir, which was a British sitcom with adults starring as teens, like we just talked about, and Room 222, which was set in the late 60s, early 70s, which kind of did touch on like some racial stuff and the Vietnam War and things like that. So it started getting into a little bit of that controversial territory. Interestingly, the score of Room 222 was done by Jerry Goldsmith.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
I had to share that because I know you love him so much.
I
So
do.
in the early 70s, TV programmers began to realize that there was plenty of content for families, but there wasn't really anything directed at this teen audience who was definitely watching TV. There wasn't like something for them. And so in 1972, Kismet happened, and Martin Tossi and Brandon Stoddard at ABC created the ABC After School Special, and it was an immediate hit. And I found this really great clip of Mr. Stoddard sort of describing that early movement.
We added the ABC After School Specials. We put that on the air, and this was when there was a beginning of criticism about children's programming, rightfully so, by the way. And partially as a result of that criticism, and partially because of some advertising reasons, which we could talk about, we developed the ABC After School Specials. Only one of the reasons that we're successful was he ran them at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and they were viewed by kids and their mother instead of just the kid alone. So the kid could talk with the mother about the issue, if so, say family divorce, and understand it and work it out with their own mother and with the parental guidance. So we won every single award you could possibly imagine.
Don't you love the way he caught himself and said mother instead of parent?
Yes. Oh yes, because the mother is always at home.
That's right. It's not
Chained to the
necessarily
sink.
untrue.
No, considering the period, no.
Yes. So, so the show did come on like right after school, obviously, thus the name. It covered a lot of teen issues like substance abuse and life as a foster kid and other Gen X staples from our growing up years. Many kids at that time probably hadn't even been exposed to discussions and conversations about those topics. I mean, it was sort of like you don't talk about these things, right? And so the by the third season, there was really like the first couple seasons, it wasn't super edgy, but it really does get into that. You get all kinds of very topical content. Some of it's really, really dark, like the don't touch thing. And then one is, the day my kid went punk, which is a very terrifying thing to deal with as a family, I'm sure. But yeah, I mean, it was conversations about things that otherwise weren't really discussed with any reality or depth. And one of the cool things that they did was that they rarely gave happy endings to these things to neatly tie everything up. Like the producer said that the show had to be real in terms of not adults solving the problems for the kids, but the kids figuring out a way to solve the problems for themselves, which to me, is there anything more Gen X than that? Like,
yeah,
we're not going to help you. You're basically grown. Solve your own problems. It'll go great.
yeah.
So,
and also the kids code as well, which is, don't ask a parent about anything, just try and figure it out yourself.
yeah,
Which
sure.
always works out well.
Really great problem solving. So a lot of those led to the very special episodes that we love so much from like primarily sitcoms, I remember in the 80s. And a lot of times they would have like some new walk-on character that wasn't any key member of the cast that would have that problem, whether it was like a drug problem or, whatever, so that none of your key, like your main show's characters were tainted by it, but they could still kind of react to it in their wholesome way and not like, I never did that, but, Susie did it and blah, blah, blah. And I thought it was kind of interesting. I sort of did a cross-section check of like, what were some of the things that came up? And I wanted to pick a topic that we will be discussing during the show later on, which is teen pregnancy. So that was like a hot topic in the 80s. And I just pulled some random clips from some of our big shows. I'm sure many people recognize the voices and the people on these shows. So here's a clip of teen pregnancy on 80s TV.
Ellen, what is it?
I think I'm pregnant.
Pregnant? Well, how did that happen?
Yeah, Kevin's told us quite a bit about you. But not that.
Oh, yeah, I forgot. She's gonna have a baby.
Thank you, Kevin.
I don't know what to do, Mel. I'm scared. Well, what'd the doctor say? You have Blue Cross?
Fred, I think I know how you feel about Mary.
No, you don't.
You feel because Mary went out and got herself pregnant, she's a slut. Well, let me tell you what a slut is. It's somebody who gets knocked up in the back seat of a Studebaker at a drive-in movie. It was a Studebaker, wasn't it, Dorothy?
You've got to love Estelle Getty, bless her.
I do. I mean, that's such a charged word these days that when I was sort of scrolling through it, I was like, oh my God, but the vapors. Like, it was shocking to hear the slut word drop there. But yeah, no, that is literally, and they don't, a lot of times they don't talk. Like, that's one of the only reactions that felt genuine, because back then anybody that got pregnant as a teenager, that's what everybody said about them, whether it was fair or not. That's just, the unfortunate reality of how life was at that time, and probably still is in many cases. I don't know, but
yeah, and it's always the girl's fault.
Of course, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I thought that, all of this is important because to talk about, in my opinion, because in the modern world, a lot of kids do have access to a lot of representations on in media in some form or fashion of whatever their personal situation is. So they can see examples of how different choices that they make around what they're going through may play out, and how, like, what the impact of all of that might be. But we just really didn't have that in the 80s. So these shows were like kind of a big deal for kids, even if we would sort of laugh them off and kind of go, oh, those after school specials, or oh, whatever. It still was like, when it finally got to something that impacted you, you were like secretly going into your room and watching it and going, okay, what do they have to say about it? But there were only really two shows that dug into middle school and secondary school topics in the 70s and 80s, which we'll talk about. But before we do that, Conrad, you and I are so simpatico about this, that we love spreadsheets and data. And so yes. I thought that we should play to our strengths and have something called Spreadsheet Corner, where before we go into the topic, we talk about and show some stats around this to sort of help frame the topic for everyone. And the very first one, especially for I don't know if this is helpful for our UK folks, but for Americans, the way you guys call your grades, like the labels for all of your different grades, are super confusing to us. So I thought it might be helpful, so that we're all talking about the same thing, to look at, the names of certain things. So we're talking about ages, say 11 through 15, 10, 11 to 15. So for us in the US, that's like 6th grade through about 9th grade. And loosely, is middle school, although it's kind of the end of elementary school and the beginning of high school for us. But we'll just call it middle school for the sake of standardization. Yeah. And then you guys, is it right to say that year 7 through year 10, or first form through fourth form, sort of are close to secondary school age? Is that accurate?
Yeah, so now it's 7 to 11, as you can see here, is secondary school, and then you go into lower sixth and upper sixth. And for me, it's even more confusing because in the UK it changed from when I was at school to now. So now parents come up to me and they say, "Yeah, my kid's in year 6," and it's like, I don't know what that means. So they changed it at some point from imperial to metric, and I missed it. So.
Oh dear.
But yes,
Imperial, that metric system, it ruins everything, Conrad.
Doesn't it just? But yeah, so this is a really handy chart for reference.
Yes, I do think it's helpful. So another thing that I wanted to point out is the fact that shows about teens, like we already sort of touched on, were not very common. Like you started seeing some in like the 70s. I mean, you even had things like Welcome Back, Kotter, and those aren't necessarily super reflective of a real teen experience, but they are kind of talking about teens. So, but even that drastically increased after the 80s. So these shows that were very successful, including the after school specials, but then the two shows that we're going to talk about, really, I think, paved the way for the shows that come in the 90s and now. Because there isn't anything besides the 90s and everything after the 90s, if you ask me. But anyway, I just wanted to show the number of live action teen shows, so we're not counting animation, by decade. So this isn't a perfect graph because I can't necessarily have a complete list of every single show that's ever been made, but this is ballpark, right? So, you look at, no more than about 5 or so through the 70s. And then you have about 10 in the 80s. And then in the 90s, that jumps to 37, and then 52 in the aughts, and then 86 in the 2010s. So that's a huge jump. That's like 270% increase in live teen shows from the 80s to the 90s. So that says something in terms of numbers, and advertisers are going to take notice of that too, right?
Yeah.
And then the last thing that I will talk about before I give the floor to you, Conrad, is just the age of the characters that are playing, the actors that are playing the characters. So, I think of things like in Gilmore Girls, you have Lane, who is playing like a 16, 17, 18-year-old, but she's played by someone who's almost 30, I believe. She doesn't look it, but you sense it, right? Like when you talk to an actual 16-year-old that you see in real life, you're like, oh, this is a child. Because when you see someone like Charisma Carpenter, like you mentioned, she's like 26, and she
was 27 when she started playing Cordelia.
Right.
So in Buffy. So yeah, it's crazy. So the shows that we're going to talk about today, the average age difference between the main cast members and the roles they're playing is 1.6 or 1.7 for my show and for yours respectively. Whereas in the 90s, the average was somewhere around 8 to 9 years.
8 to 9 years. So like, you're talking about the difference between like a 15-year-old playing a 14-year-old versus a 25-year-old playing a 16-year-old.
Yeah. And in fact, it was so ridiculous that when you found out what age the character was supposed to be, you would go, what? Sorry, really?
Have you seen a 15-year-old recently? Or talked to one? Because... so I have this fun slide. So this basically just shows your character age. So you've got you can see that it kind of jumps, and basically what this graph is showing for those who are listening is once you hit about age 14, you can start having much older characters play that character. If you can find someone who's very youthful looking, you can have, and certainly once you get to 16 and 17 and 18, that's really easy, right? But it's hard to find someone who can play a 10-year-old who's an adult. And I mean, there are a lot of reasons why you'd want to do that, right? Because I mean, you have child labor laws, you have like all these restrictions and that you wouldn't want to have to deal with necessarily. But yeah, it does sort of, it's not great in terms of realism, right?
No, it's not. One of the things, I mean, I'll probably mention Heartstopper about 1,000,000 times during the course of this podcast, but yeah, it's one of my favorite shows. It's on Netflix, and it's very good in terms of LGBTQ representation. And one of the major characters in that, Nick Nelson, is played by Kit Connor, who is, I think he's just turned 18, and he's playing a 16-year-old. But he's a bit of a gym rat in real life, but when he got cast in the role, he stopped going to the gym and put on weight because he wanted A, baby fat, and B, not an unrealistic body expectation.
Yeah.
So
And I think
he
he
deliberately
totally
did
sells
that.
it. Yeah, he
Yeah,
definitely
he does.
looks like a, age appropriate person. He doesn't look like a 24-year-old, who's
No,
ripped with
no.
washboard abs, as we were
Yeah.
talking. That's going to be the thing that we just keep going back to.
Yes. This is the abs episode. That's what we should have called it. Abs.
Yeah, abs instead of high. All right, so Conrad, here's the big reveal. What show was the foundational show that you decided to teach us about today?
Well, if you want a cultural exchange and you want to find out about a high school set show in the UK, then, I mean, all the people watching from the UK now are going to know exactly what I'm going to talk about, which is Grange Hill, a BBC TV show that ran, well, it started to air in 1978. It was the brainchild of Phil Redmond, a writer-producer from Lancashire. Quick tip for Americans: if you're ever faced with the name of a British county and it's got Shire on the end of it, you pronounce it Sheer, not Shire. It's not Hobbiton. British pronunciation is fun. Sorry about
That
that.
ruins my entire experience of that.
Yes. Sorry about that.
No, but that is helpful. The knowledge so that I don't look like an idiot. Thank you.
Yes. So Phil Redmond, so that's in the north of England. He was trained as a quantity surveyor, but he went to the University of Liverpool with dreams of becoming a writer. He'd been studying the sociology of education, particularly the work of a sociologist called John Holt, on how children in the contemporary schooling system were actually being taught just how to avoid being embarrassed in front of a large group of people, rather than having their intellectual and creative capacity nurtured and stimulated in some way.
Wow.
Which is not great. So he was thinking a lot about that, and he was a student at the time, and the idea for the show Grange Hill came to him. He says, quote, "The light bulb moment for Grange Hill occurred as I was walking into the Dole office in Hardman Street during the Easter vacation in 1976. Side note, the Dole in the UK is unemployment benefit."
Oh, I know that because of Wham.
Ah, okay.
The Wham rap. Was it who know will know? Okay, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So his quote continues. Now only a student and no longer on the professional and executive register, this meant queuing up with the real people. And that ends his quote. So essentially what happened was he witnessed a man at the counter being humiliated because he wasn't able to read. And this galvanized two things in Phil Redmond. First of all, determination to support adult literacy programs, which he has maintained to this day. It's probably one of the reasons why he's now Sir Phil Redmond. But also a sudden interest in creating a socially realist depiction of school, rather than the sort of things that you'd seen before, which you mentioned earlier, which was the boarding school, private school kind of experience.
Right.
You know, the St. Trinians kind of thing, the sort of thing that Harry Potter really feeds on, actually. And he wanted to show inner city kids in a comprehensive school, not one of these old boarding private schools. It was commissioned by the BBC Executive for Children's Drama in 1976 and began airing in 1978. Redmond was keen for it not to fall into the trap of being London-centric, like most of the output of the BBC, because it's based in London.
Sure.
So he set Grange Hill in an unspecified inner city area, and although it was filmed in London, he worked hard to ensure the underground and big red buses didn't appear frequently in the background. Although they did start sneaking in 1982 when he was away working on another series, Brookside, a soap opera. The show was famous for tackling serious issues such as bullying, racism, teenage pregnancy, suicide, and most notoriously in the season I've chosen to review for this episode, drug addiction and romantic relationships between teachers and students.
Oh, delightful.
Yes, isn't it just?
It's great.
Not the same character, I hasten to add,
I mean,
that would be
that's
lot.
a troubled teen, is what that is.
It really is. As you can imagine, this kind of a realistic portrayal of life in school started to worry parents. They thought that this cannot possibly be an accurate portrayal of what was going on in their little darlings' schools. But as it turned out, when they questioned their kids about it, it was in fact mild, as this extra from the show explained in a behind-the-scenes documentary that was shot and aired in 1987.
I think if you went to a normal school, just a comprehensive school, and filmed for the whole day what was going on, you'd be surprised. Compared to Grange Hill's mild.
Yes, and for people who are listening...
I do adore her hair, though. That
Yeah.
is spectacular, but...
That's one of the reasons why I chose that clip, is not just the relevance of the comment, but also the fact that it's just a spectacular hairdo. But yes, so as it turned out, it was mild compared to what was actually going on in schools. So the parents were still horrified and glad that this had been brought to their attention. The show, as a result, was hugely popular with kids who finally had something that they could watch that they could relate to in the UK. Some of its characters became cultural icons. Kids who started watching it from its inception in the late 70s, which is before my time, probably mostly remember Peter Tucker Jenkins, a rebellious kid in a leather jacket, played by Todd Carty for 4 series of the main show, and popular enough to get his own spin-off show, Tucker's Luck, which ran for 3 seasons. And fans of sci-fi and fantasy will remember Todd Carty for his small but significant role in the wonderful fantasy movie Krull from 1983.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
He does look like the kind of boy I would have wanted to date in junior high school, though.
Is it the leather jacket?
Yeah, it's just the bad boy look. He's got the bad boy look hard. I mean, he's leaning hard into that. Good for him. He's doing it well.
Well, he's mostly known in the UK for Grange Hill and for his long-running appearance on the soap opera EastEnders. But yes, he was in a sci-fi and fantasy movie. Many elements of the show became iconic, particularly its opening title sequence, which was in the style of a comic book. I was more fond of, found more memorable some of the teacher characters. So, for example, the pencil-moustached, toupeed, tyrannical disciplinarian Mr. Bronson, who was played by the late Michael Sheard for 5 years between 1985 and 1989. And I have a clip here of the character when he introduced himself.
I am, as you are doubtless aware, a strict disciplinarian. I am also fair.
Yes, and terrifying.
It's terrifying. He reminds me of some of
Absolutely.
my teachers, honestly. He really does.
Yeah. Well, sharp-eyed fans of science fiction franchises that were also shot in the UK around about that time will recognise Michael Sheard. And I have to say, it wasn't a big surprise to British kids in the 80s when they discovered that Mr. Bronson was in the Empire as Admiral Ozzel with Darth Vader, and in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade turned out to be Hitler. So there we go. Yeah.
Well, he was. I will say I watched this particular season of Grange Hill just so that I could kind of get an idea of what the gist was, and he was pretty hardcore. Like, he was not a likable teacher at all.
No, he wasn't, although Michael Shea had always claimed that he had a heart of gold, but
whatever you say.
I'm not convinced personally.
No.
I was also thinking that the show poses some challenges for American viewers. I'm not sure if you discovered this, particularly the kids' accents. There's a character,
especially since I didn't have subtitles, so I was really struggling.
You were a bit lost in a few cases.
But to my own credit, I have to say really quickly that part of that is because they filmed, especially in the outdoor scenes, which there will be scenes where the kids are walking and talking. They would have like one kid would be mic'd, I think, and then they just used that one mic for all the kids. And so there was a lot of background noise and not great sound quality. So I'm going to give myself a little permission. It's not just the accent thing. It's like the sound quality.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair enough. I'm not even sure they had radio mics back then, so I think it's all a boom microphone trying to chase kids muttering under their breath as they're walking away from the camera.
Yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's not ideal. So, in particular, there's a character that I imagine you had a lot of fun with, which is the character who's introduced in Series 9, the series that I was looking at from 1986. Ziggy Greaves.
Oh, yes.
He's a Liverpudlian, so from up north. Same as Simon Barber, who's just guested on the Movie Oubliette show for our Christmas special.
I mean, it's a tough accent for Americans. Or at least for this American, I will say it is challenging for me,
to say the least. Yeah. So I don't know. I put translations of what Ziggy is saying on the screen. I don't know if you want to look away and try and guess what he's saying.
Yes, I'm not gonna look. Okay, and then.
Okay, so here is Ziggy. He's the second voice you'll hear.
But this time we mustn't fail.
That Dave said there's more than a broom full of water based on her head.
Any idea?
Oh my God! The first kid said something like "we mustn't fail," and then I think, and then the second kid said blah, blah, something. I thought I had the end part of it, but no, Oh my God! Wow! Wow!
Yes, I think he refers to.
Now. Oh my God, that's crazy.
It's not the easiest thing to grasp. Here's another bit in case you want to try that.
Well, it's all we got, so make the most of it.
But after what he did to my back with that fiberglass, it's an out.
Something. Oh yeah, I got that one because I could see his face. It helps me to look at his face when he's talking for some reason. Yeah. But this was the thing about the fiberglass, right?
It was, yeah. So the storyline whereby a character had fiberglass stuff down his back, which was
so like Imelda in this show. This character Imelda, who is the bully, the sort of, I guess she's the running bully character in Grange Hill. She is
certainly for this series
monstrous. Like, she literally gets this insulation she pulls out of the wall that's got asbestos in it, and she rams it down this kid's shirt and scratches his flesh off of his back with it. And I'm like, oh my God, you guys are hardcore.
Yeah, we didn't screw around with our depictions of bullying. I think later on in the series, there's a moment where she's found questioning the science teacher about the efficacy of rat poison on humans. And at that point, alarm bells start ringing. So yeah, Imelda was, she was pretty hardcore.
Yes.
It also presents some traditions of British schools that might be alien to American viewers. For example, morning assemblies and wearing school uniform which I imagine are fairly alien concepts for you guys. It also introduced some concepts that I found completely alien. For example, they seem to have a permanent nightclub in operation on the school grounds that they can just dip into in between classes.
I remember the first time I saw this on the screen, and I was just like, okay, what is happening in the school system? Like, first of all, I'm really mad because I wanted to have a dance club in school every day. Secondly, I found out that you guys don't even have to go to school after age like 16 technically. So like I just felt completely ripped off all the way around.
Yeah, I can imagine. So did I. Although, to be honest, whenever we used to hold dances like this, it would just be the guys standing at the edges, shuffling vaguely, and the girls would be dancing. So it would have been a complete failure anyway. Incidentally, the character who is on the screen, sorry, podcast listeners, at the moment, that's a character called Laura Regan, who was introduced in this series, played by Fiona Mogridge, who I thought was just the height of English Rose beauty in 1986. I'm pleased to report she is still a very beautiful woman. She is now named Fiona McLean, and she is a professional photographer and very successful at it. So
she does look like the kind of girl that like I would have been super jealous of in junior high or high school, because she would have been like, you know, she doesn't have to wear a lot of makeup. She doesn't have crazy, insane hair, but she's just really naturally lovely. And she's probably like really nice too. She looks very much like a girl I went to school with named Amy, who like, she was nice and sweet and everybody liked her. And like, I was the mean, like she was blonde and I was brunette. It was just a whole thing.
Yeah. No, I think every class had one of these. Mine was a girl called Julia Fletcher. Yeah, just academically brilliant, lovely, gorgeous, didn't care about that. It was, just...
I'm trying desperately to make my camera focus and it's not working.
Oh, yes. That's always fun.
Whoops.
So, Grange, so that's a quick whistle-stop tour of Grange Hill. We'll go into more details into some of the topics it covered later, but the show ran... for 30 years, 601 episodes. It was finally cancelled in 2008, although it was reported as recently as January this year that Phil Redmond is working on a film script, which he hopes would get produced and released next year. I haven't heard any news since then.
Film script. I wonder what that would look like.
Yeah. Well, he said he'd try and get some of the old characters back for the 80s nostalgia, so we'll see.
Well, I'm just curious before I start with my section, like, what was your personal experience with seeing this show? Like, and what was your impression of it back in the day? Like, did you think that it was like super accurate or not? Or
no, not really. So it was addicting. I mean, I used to watch it all the time. As soon as you got home from school, you would watch it. And it was funny. It was really strange. I haven't obviously revisited it since it aired. So to sit and watch it, because it's all on BritBox here, the streaming service now. So I watched season 9 all the way through over a couple of weeks. And it's just bizarre because all of these memories would come flooding back and I recognized all of the characters and remembered all of the things that happened to them. So, it was kind of a soap opera for kids. So you sort of accepted that this wasn't reality. It was a version of reality. The kids didn't swear. They didn't speak like we did. All of them seemed to have nicknames beginning with a Z for some reason, like Zammo and Ziggy, which, I mean, none of the guys I knew had nicknames. They were just called by their names. So I don't know what was going on there. But in terms of the topics it covered, the thing that I found fascinating revisiting it is just how groundbreaking it really was.
Right.
And how well it presented the topics that it was talking about and how responsibly it covered them and how helpfully, usefully it covered them for the kids watching, which we'll talk about more. But I can see why it's held in high regard even now, because if you watch it again, some of the things it's doing in the way it's presenting things is really quite impressive, even for, well, especially for 1980.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it's interesting that you mentioned that the creator of the show was a sociologist, because that really tracks with the way the show is sort of structured, because unlike the show I'm going to talk about, it sort of has just characters, sort of very soap opera like. They just have their ongoing storylines, and they each one may, there isn't like a theme of an episode per se. It's just kind of a continuation, almost like modern TV, where you just have like these long story arcs over an entire season as opposed to episodic type television, which I thought was interesting. Very different take on how to approach these things.
Yeah.
So, yeah, well, that's interesting. So your show started in 1978, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so no one's probably going to be terribly surprised that my show that I'm talking about starts in 1979 and is Degrassi, the whole Degrassi series. So, Degrassi was started by a woman named Linda Schuyler, who was actually born in London, and she moved to Ontario, Canada, in 1957 at age 9, and she she got a scholarship to college, but decided that wasn't for her, so she kind of went to a teacher's college instead and became a teacher. And she began teaching grades 7 through 8, and she really loved that age group, which was rare because a lot of people don't love that age group a lot. She taught
just to remind me, what ages is that?
So grades 7 through 8 would be like age 12, 13, 14, like right in the middle of the age group we're talking about.
Yeah.
She taught for 4 years in London, and then she taught another 4 in Toronto, Canada, where she was really stunned by the diversity. And she was teaching, I thought this was so interesting, she was teaching media studies to those kids, including filmmaking. I can't even imagine having that as an option in school, like at that age. But she ended up meeting up with a man named Kit Hood at a filmmakers co-op, and Kit also had been born in England, and he was a film editor there with the Walt Disney Productions group in London before he moved to Canada at age 23. And they decided to make a documentary called Between Two Worlds, which touched on racism and what it's like for kids of different races living in Canada. And I think it's in Toronto specifically. And then in 1976, they founded the Playing with Time production company, and the name was inspired by their documentary called Jimmy Playing with Time, which was about a New Zealand-born 73-year-old Jimmy Montecasino who tries to beat his own world record for marathon piano playing. And he was this was at the 1976 Canadian National Exhibition in Toronto. Now, I looked high and low to try to find any footage from this thing or any other details about what happened to this man. Was he successful? And I could not find anything. So it is extremely obscure. But they had the voice of Ken James as the voice of Time, which provided a hallucinating dialogue with Montecasino. So it sounds like it was very avant-garde and a little odd. But anyway, so they made a 30-minute piece called Ida Makes a Movie after that, which laid a foundation for The Kids of Degrassi Street, which was one of the few non-animated shows aimed at children, and it ran from 1979 to 1986. And they even had illustrated books themed after that show. And I think that these are very, definitely aimed at very young children. Now, the Kids of Degrassi Street, you're talking kids who are like 8, 9, 10. So even younger kids, right? And so another noteworthy difference of the Degrassi show was the use of ordinary people rather than experienced and trained actors. So the series was a critical success, with the episode Griff Makes a Date winning an International Emmy Award. So a lot of people were starting to give recognition to this very public television, type of thing. Well, so coming out of that was Degrassi Junior High. Okay, go ahead, do it. Fix my mic.
I'm gonna fix your mic. Okay, mic's going in and out. Settings. We're gonna go to this. Sorry for the. Here's what we're gonna do.
Can you hear me?
Not yet. Okay. All right. Try that.
Can you hear me? Can you
I
hear me?
can, yes.
Okay, good. Okay. So the Degrassi Junior High was the successor, but not a continuation of The Kids of Degrassi Street. And it aired for 3 seasons, starting in 1986 and going to 1989. So starting the same year as the season of Grange Hill that you chose, or the series. I don't know. What's the right word, Conrad?
I think it's series rather than season, but I've said season a couple of times. So
Okay. I don't want to say the wrong thing. So, so Linda Schuyler, the creator of the show, she really felt strongly that we shouldn't tiptoe around tough topics with kids. And so she had this to say about that.
I think it's very important that sexual matters, death, whatever are the human emotions and experiences that are liable to confront all of us as we pass through ages and stages in our life, as long as it's discussed in a healthy and wholesome manner, I don't think there's any topic that can't be discussed.
So speaking of amazing hair, Linda with her amazing 80s hair, but she does look like every teacher I had in the 80s though at the same time. But yeah, she's like that wonderful, like, we need to talk about all of this stuff instead of continuing to bury it, you know, like, because that's how you get, you know, healthier, more well-rounded children. And it's a passion for her as a teacher. So her background coming from the perspective of being a teacher, I think really shows in Degrassi Junior High, as opposed to looking at it more like a sociologist, which shows up in Grange Hill a little bit more. And that's not to say one's better or worse. It's just to sort of, they're just sort of coming at it from a different perspective. Some of the topics that get discussed in Degrassi were things like teen pregnancy. Hang on, I could have sworn I had a lovely slide about this, but now I don't see it. So I guess I don't have it. But the teen pregnancy was a big one that ends up getting discussed. Sorry, I lost my place. Substance abuse, misogyny, homophobia, body image, racism, sexual assault, and child abuse, and death. So all of these things end up getting discussed on the show. And it's just kind of crazy when, like, I remember thinking how crazy it was to see someone who looked like they were my age talking about all of this stuff. So unlike the trend of casting, like we've talked about, young adults or, you know, 20-somethings to play teenagers, Degrassi Junior High cast real age-appropriate actors with little to no acting experience. So that was a trend that was later continued in the development of Degrassi: The Next Generation, in reaction to the 90s teen dramas that came out that you were talking about with the much older people. And they did their own hair and makeup and things like that as well to kind of enhance the realism. And so here's a tiny clip from behind the scenes documentary that they made about Degrassi.
The guys will just, they'll brush their hair in the morning and then maybe they'll just give it a quick brush when they get here. And the girls do their own makeup. We don't have our own makeup people because it's looking phony when you have, like tons of makeup on trying to make yourself and your hair all nice and hairsprayed. And when you look more natural, it's helping the show.
So you could see in that clip, you had people who really were that age, and some of them are very young looking. Like they look like some of those little boys were like, they look like they're 10, I swear to God. But that's what a 12-year-old looks like, as opposed to what you see in so many of these very glossy, sexy, Hollywoodized shows.
Yeah, where they're all painstakingly styled. I always liked that Josh Hartnett, the actor who, when he appeared in Halloween H2O, he would be sort of meticulously styled, and then as soon as the makeup person ran away, he would mess himself up, pull his collar out, pull his shirt out, and then cut a chunk out of his own hair. And you just look at him in that movie and he just looks a mess. But this is his memory of what he looked like a couple of years ago when he was in school, which is not put together and well styled at all.
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
So the selected 54 actors that they chose for this show they went through a 3-week workshop, which helped them with the basics of acting and then techniques and improvisation, and included seminars in some of the behind the scenes aspects of production, probably like standing on your mark and those kinds of things. The workshops will be repeated at the beginning of production for each season so that new cast members could sort of get the basics and older cast members could sort of have refreshers. And it's noteworthy that none of these kids were union because they're, so that's something we'll come back to a little bit later on. And the kids really did play a role in the script development. So the adults would write a script and then they would have a big read through and they would get feedback. So here is an example of what that sounded like.
Do you believe that racism still exists today? Are we dealing with an issue or are we dealing with a non-issue? Who wants to pick that one up?
At the end, what she's doing right now, it's not really rebelling, in my opinion, because she doesn't stand up to her parents. She's just going to hide it. Yeah. And it's not hard to do that.
Maybe BLT should say that.
Maybe that would be the better thing to do.
No, but if she was...
Or she could end up standing up to him that way without me having to say anything.
Yeah, but she's still under...
No, and she goes, no, and then BLT's sort of like, okay, that I don't care.
When we're at those read-throughs, Jan plays an incredibly crucial role. He's listening, he's writing, he hears how they say it in their own vernacular. It's just a wonderful example of the adult, the professional talents of an adult merging with the raw, open emotions of the adolescent.
Wow.
So she really, again, you're not getting what I would consider the real thing because you don't have it laden with profanity, which was my experience. But aside from that, you do have the reactions generally did kind of match, maybe without as much like bullying and attacking as I would see, because I think kids would self-censor a little bit around adults at all and try to maybe hide the fact that like if a girl comes to school pregnant, right, the reaction is going to be, oh, you're a slut, oh, you're this, and then you're going to get made fun of by boys and girls. They may not want to say that to Linda.
No.
But I still think that overall there is an enormous amount of effort being made to try and pull some of that out. Like to your, like in same with Grange Hill, like they're trying to tease out what it's really like for kids. And it's an experience that's difficult to document because it's very raw and it's also fraught with like anything you made about it wouldn't be suitable for children to watch.
Yeah. Which is always a challenge. Yeah, it is always a challenge. Heartstopper, for example, sorry, mentioning it again.
Someone keep the tally.
Yep. It's dealing with LGBTQ relationships and experiences of all kinds across the spectrum, actually, which is lovely to see. But of course, they can never actually swear during the show. And they specifically said that they wanted to do that because they wanted 12-year-olds to be able to watch it.
Right, exactly.
So, they just have to take that stuff out.
Sure. And it's Canadian public television or American public television. So you're not going to get the F-bombs that you would in a schoolyard in seventh grade.
Absolutely not. It's really interesting seeing Degrassi's process there behind the scenes, because the behind the scenes that I was watching for that clip I played earlier,
yes,
it clearly shows that the Grange Hill, by contrast, was completely scripted. The kids had absolutely no input. You saw them go through the process of a read-through and then a rehearsal, and then the producing team would sit around and talk about all the failings and how they were going to have to rewrite it to make it so that the kids could actually perform it reasonably well. And the way that they spoke to each other and the sort of things that they said, you'd watch the show and just think, this is not really the way that we speak to each other, but fine. But again, you just accepted it on a different level. At least they were tackling the issues that we dealt with to some degree, which was great. But yeah, the way that it was presented was not necessarily accurate.
Yeah. So let's see, I first encountered this show in 1988 in seventh grade. So I was the same age as most of these actors and characters when we watched the episodes in Miss Williams' life skills class. And then we got into groups after we would watch the episode and discuss like how we would have done things differently or what we would have done the same and why. Um, and I guess Linda would have been thrilled that we were doing that in real time. And I didn't end up seeing actually the whole series because I don't think I had it. We lived on a military base, and I don't think it came on. As far as I knew, it didn't come on. I literally saw it in class, and I think that it was like a VHS tape that was sent out like to teachers to do that exact thing with in schools. I ended up seeing the whole series in around 2014 when I borrowed the whole set from one of our retroblasting subscribers, who was kind enough to like ship the entire series to me in the individual DVDs, which was a huge box of DVDs.
Wow.
Of course, now I own the whole series, including The Kids of Degrassi Street, Degrassi High, you know, and I've watched it numerous times through because I'm obsessed. One of the funny things that I found was, so one of the big storylines in Degrassi is this character Spike, with the crazy hair, right? She's the one with the hair sticking out everywhere. And she ends up getting pregnant at age like 14 or 15, somewhere in there. I think she's 14. And right after that, interestingly enough, she goes around and she carries an egg with her as an egg baby. I don't know if you guys do this in England, but this is a totally American thing that's in every American who's watching who's my age 100% had an egg baby that you had to like carry around for a week and care for it like it was a baby, as though that's even remotely like whatever. And then if your egg broke or whatever, you would get a 0. And the reason why you know that it is like a legit thing is, so in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, there's an episode called Bad Eggs where Buffy has the egg baby and they end up being alien like demon things. But she names her egg Egbert. And it's interesting because Spike in Degrassi also named her egg Egbert. So I just think that that's a little bit of, I mean, obviously it's a really obvious choice for a name for an egg baby, but still it made me chuckle a little bit when I saw that.
Yeah. I think Degrassi is in the Buffyverse, basically.
I think so.
Yeah.
Degrassi High came after Degrassi Junior High. So one of the things that I think is interesting is that unlike Grange Hill, Degrassi really got interested in its core characters and actors, and they just sort of follow them up. And so at the end, I know that there's a whole thing where Grange Hill, the school burns down. And I think it had happened at the end of the previous series.
Yeah,
right? Because you had
Yeah.
students going to a different location because the school burned down.
Yeah, and 2 or 3 schools merged, I think, at the beginning of Series 9. So,
Yeah.
it was a whole thing. But yeah, they would always stick with the same school and the kids would just age out. You just wouldn't see them anymore.
Yeah, well, so in Degrassi, the junior high burns down and they all move to the high school. And so you just keep following the same, it's several years worth of kids, but they all just kind of age up. Right, so you have Degrassi High that comes after Degrassi Junior High with many of the same characters, just older. Yeah.
Wow.
So I think now we've kind of got a really good foundation. I think we should talk about how each of the shows sort of tackles different key topics and what they're teaching kids, not just about the issue itself, but like how kids should tackle these things and then the obstacles you would face when doing so. So I think one of the things we started with was how kids deal with like absent parents.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which in the series of Grange Hill I watched, it cropped up only in the case of one family, which is the Webb family, a side character, Louise Webb. And she is discovered to be parenting her younger siblings because her mother is no longer on the scene and her father is in hospital. The father dies later on in the series, which puts the family at risk of being put into the social care system and possibly being split up. Finally, another character's father, who's a lawyer, manages to locate the mother and she returns to take up the parental responsibility. So everyone's saved by the end of the series. The series tend to wrap up sort of story arcs quite nicely. They didn't continue into the next season necessarily. Notably, it has to be said, the Webbs are a black family, and their story isn't told from their perspective. But yeah, it's the white saviors that come in and try to help them out. On the one hand, you wonder if that's a bit of a trope or a cliche. But in terms of the way that presents it, it's sort of they try to hide it, and it becomes untenable. It sort of starts to affect Louise's life, her schoolwork, and it's only when she is honest with her friends and her friends step in and the teachers step in and the parents step in and work together to solve the problem, that things work out for the best, which I guess is a good story about, being emotionally honest and open and dealing with your problems rather than trying to cope with them by yourself and hiding them, which not a bad story to tell, I guess.
Yeah, I think to me the biggest problem with the way that you were describing that is just the whole, it's not told from those characters' perspective. It's told like, I don't know. It's sort of like that movie, The Help, I think is what it's called, where it's sort of like about the white people's reaction to the way black characters are treated, as opposed to just being about the black characters.
Yeah.
But
black characters tended not to be the central characters in Grange Hill.
Right.
Generally not members of the principal cast.
Well, I think it's interesting. One of the things, and we were talking about absent parents, and one of the criticisms that I came across of Degrassi Junior High is there's a character called Lucy, and she's a person of color. I don't know if she's, exactly what her background is, but her parents are always gone. And so one of the criticisms was like, oh, well, she's the black character, so therefore, like, her parents are gone. And that is racist. And I mean, I'm not saying that it's not racist, but what I am saying is the way that it was always presented in the show is her parents were extremely successful career people, both of them.
Oh, okay.
And so they were always gone, like, on business trips and away from home because they were working late at some big corporate thing. And she always had like this really nice house that everybody always wanted to go to. And they always had a fully stocked bar. And so everyone always wanted to go to a party at Lucy's house because her parents were gone, but it was a really nice place. It was a lovely home, So I just think that it's nuanced. It's not just a complete, I don't know. It's complicated, but I just think that it's not like as bad as some of the other examples of that I've seen, for sure. I will say in Degrassi Junior High, they do talk about, in terms of missing parents, there was a plot line where one of the main characters, who is my favorite character in the show, Wheels, his parents die, and they're killed in a car accident. And it's really interesting because the actual actor, his father had died just before that, and that was sort of what motivated them to write that storyline, was because they had been warned. Wow. And so here's a clip of Neil talking about that whole process.
Every year, the kids were saying, we got to have a story about death, and we were reluctant to do it because how do you begin to do it? Well, the obvious person to perform it would be Neil. Is that a good idea? Is it fair to him? Is he ready for it? And he was very enthusiastic about it. He wanted to do it. He had a lot of confirmations, suggestions.
When I lost my dad, I felt more sad than angry. I wasn't going to turn it down because then I thought that it would be a good experience for myself to do it. And at first I was scared to go into filming of it. I was kind of worried that I was going to start thinking about my father again. And what was really weird, when we were filming the funeral scene in the cemetery, I just looked at one of those caskets and, that's all I saw was my father laying there. And which I thought, in a way, it helped, because then I was putting my emotions along with Wheel's emotions into it.
Wow. So I thought that was particularly, poignant to literally have a teen who just lost their father, like, then act that out on a show. I don't know if it's 100% responsible. Obviously, for anyone who follows Degrassi Junior High or knows anything, you know that Neil Hope had a lot of problems after the show ended. He became an alcoholic himself and had a lot of health problems and things like that, and sadly passed away. But yeah, I just think that the intent behind them doing it and sort of getting his input and asking him, do you want to do this? I think that's sort of groundbreaking, to treat kids that age like, they have an opinion that matters, and showing what that experience feels like.
Yeah, and it seemed to me that he was a fairly good age. I mean, how old was he there?
I think the character was somewhere around 15 or 16, somewhere right in there, I think.
Yeah, okay. So you're not asking a 12-year-old to revisit a childhood trauma.
Right, no.
Yeah. A little bit more emotionally equipped to deal with it.
Yes. Well, a little bit. I mean, I don't know if any of us are ever emotionally equipped to deal with that, but
No.
but yes. One of the things that I wanted to skip to is when I watched about half the season, really, I think, of Grange Hill. And the biggest thing, and you've kind of already mentioned it, but teachers in that show are dicks. Like, they are so, I don't know, like, they're just the worst. It's not just the character that you talked about. So an example of things that happen, right, is one teacher will say, okay, I'm going to tell you to go cut class and go. I need you to go run over here and tell this other teacher this thing. And he's like, but I'm going to get in trouble, and I'm going to get, if I do this. And he's like, no, you won't. And so the kid goes and does what he says to do. And the kid gets in trouble, like, over and over and over for doing what teachers are telling him to do. And the teacher's like, no, I'm still mad at him. He still got detention because he wasn't where he was supposed to be. And I'm like, that just enraged me. I don't know what.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the show, I'm not sure how Degrassi was presented, but the dramatic focus is split about 1/3 teachers, 2/3 pupils. Was
Okay.
Degrassi all pupil focused pretty much?
Yes. Teachers were there, but they were there for students to react to. So there would be a few episodes where you would have a teacher. I mean, certainly I'll point out a couple instances of that. And you have like a few, Miss Avery being like one of the super nice teachers. I always feel like she's the stand-in for Linda, the show creator, as like this amazingly kind, gentle teacher that all the kids look up to and whatever. But no, there's not really any of the cool political maneuverings, for example, that you do see in Grange Hill.
Right. Yeah, so it was really interesting. That was probably one of the attractions of the show for kids, was that you got to see inside the teachers' the teachers' restroom, which
always something you wanted to see, right?
Yeah, and it's just a cloud of smoke where they're all smoking constantly.
And when you say restroom, you mean like not toilet. You mean
no, the staff room. It was legendary. What goes on in the staff room? We always wondered.
I don't even know where ours was at my junior high school. Like, I literally, it was this mystery. I wondered, they had to have one, right? Like, you have to have one.
Yeah, no, I knew where ours was, and you just could not go in there. It was mystical. You couldn't go in.
Yeah.
So the show Grange Hill would show you what went on in the staff room, and it was always full of political intrigue and backstabbing and jealousy, misogyny, sexism. All kinds of issues were explored in those. And what was interesting for kids watching it, or certainly looking back on it now, is recognizing that adults are flawed and that they make mistakes, and their mistakes negatively impact the pupils, like the one that you were talking about. So that the two teachers in question, it's Mr. Bronson, of course, and Mr. Baxter, the sports teacher. And the reason that they're at loggerheads is because Mr. Bronson wanted to be the deputy head teacher, and he didn't get the job. Mr. Baxter did, and he thought that Mr. Baxter, being a sports teacher, was his intellectual inferior. So yeah, the pupil that ends up being a pawn in the middle of it all is Aunt Jones. And it escalates to the point where there's even sort of physical assaults going on with Mr. Bronson fighting with Aunt Jones in the playground. And because nobody believes him and he keeps being put in endless detentions, even his parents don't believe him, he eventually runs away from home and ends up living on the streets. And it's only when his friends find him and intervene that he comes home. And by the end of the series, he is transferred to another school where presumably he has a better time of it and a fresh start. Although it has to be said, he does make guest appearances in Series 10 because the actor in question, Ricky Simmons, was a bit of a heartthrob. I don't see it myself.
Cute. He's kind of cute. I think he's cute.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, he's a child, so I'm not going to...
Yeah, it's not doing anything for you. But yeah, teachers are dicks.
They are.
Teachers are dicks in Grange Hill.
They really are.
Yeah.
And I mean, we had in Degrassi Junior High, I think the worst teacher, there's really only one bad teacher, and he's a substitute teacher, and he basically molests 2 students. And it is so cringy to watch because, again, you've got actual children playing these roles, and you have this substitute teacher who's going, again, it's Lucy, who I mentioned earlier, and she's initially enjoying a lot of that attention because she doesn't get a lot of adult attention because her parents are sort of absentee in her life. And so to get this teacher saying all these things to her in these very grooming ways, it's like she's enjoying it and everyone's like, that's kind of creepy. You need to not be alone with him. And she's like, oh, you're just being whatever. And then he ends up like trying to he's like rubbing her shoulders. And Wheels actually like sees that, and he's like, he sort of walks in and he's like, hey, you know, do you need to come with me real quick? Cause I got a thing, and sort of gives her a way to get out of the room. She initially doesn't say anything about it because she doesn't want to bring it up. She just wants to so again, it feels very realistic, right? Like she doesn't want to go tattle and tell anybody, but then another character ends up experiencing the same thing. I think the character's name is Susie, who she's friends with and cares about, and she sees, and she's younger, he's targeting her now because he comes back as a substitute teacher, and so that's what forces her to tell on him. And you don't get to see all of that, but you see her walking in to tell the principal, like, hey, this happened. So yeah, I mean, things that, again, you don't even now really see a ton on kids shows. It's like, yeah. I mean,
you used to get it in the very special episodes in the 80s as well, didn't you? I always remember Different Strokes where
oh, yes.
Wasn't there something in a bicycle shop that everybody was traumatized by?
Yeah. The guy, and it is creepy. Like you'll see the clip on YouTube of just the guy being like, hey, don't you want this bike? And you're like, run away, stranger danger. Oh dear.
Yeah, it's not good. So Grange Hill had a similar storyline in Series 9, which many fans of the show will remember, in which a teacher strikes up a quasi-romantic relationship with a 16-year-old student. This is Peter King and Faye Lucas. And initially, it's kind of innocent enough, like you just see them sharing a coffee outside of school, which again was kind of weird. You didn't really socialize with teachers out of school. Then he gives her a lift home at one point. Then they have a trip to the cinema because although he questions whether that's a good idea, he thinks, hey, that'll be fun. What's the problem? But then all of a sudden, the next time you see them, they are walking hand in hand in the park. And it's like, oh, this is not good. But she's fine with it. She's saying to all of her friends, I'm 16, what's the problem? Which technically in 1986, yes, that was legal. But eventually...
But was it legal for a teacher, though?
Yeah.
Like a teacher of that specific student? Because it seems like that's even more gross.
In 1986, yes, it was just sort of generally frowned upon. So the way this storyline was resolved was that he resigned after a school governors meeting, which is kind of like the Parent Teachers Association. The school governors have a meeting to discuss this and another matter, which is that they've discovered that there is an unmarried mother among the teaching staff, which, I mean, that's even worse than a paedophile, let's be honest.
I mean, super bad.
In the 80s.
Super bad.
Yeah, super bad. So this was the sort of the way it was dealt with then, which is just shame and then quiet resignation, and then he'll move on to a different school where hopefully he won't fall in love with a 16-year-old and start dating her. I have to say that that is now illegal, which is great.
That is great. I mean, baby steps.
Baby steps. So you obviously the legal age for having sex is 16 in this country, but if you are over the age of 18 and you're in a position of authority over someone who is under 18, it's illegal to involve them in sexual activities. So teachers, scout leaders, driving instructors, you're not supposed to be.
Priests. Oh, I didn't say that.
Anyway. Yeah. Yes. So you're not allowed to do that anymore. Thank goodness.
Well, it may or may not surprise you to know that here in the States, it varies by state.
Of course.
When you're old enough to have sex and with whom. So, like, the rules are a little bit different, for statutory rape, which is what it's called. But then you've also got, like, the fact that I think there's at least one state where you can get married when you're 13 or 14.
Oh my.
That trumps that, right? Like, so if you get married, obviously you. So it's confusing and it's not always super fun to read into all of that history and modern day. Another thing, speaking of outdated ideas and things that are crazy, in looking at this, so one of my reactions to watching Grange Hill was, as I spoke about Imelda, so she's this character who is the literal worst. Like, she is just, you just want to strangle her. Like, I wish I had gone to school with her because I would have kicked her butt. But anyway, that's the thing, is like nobody else like decides to really stand up to her, including the teachers. Like, it's appalling to me the way she talks to teachers, the way she talks to other students in front of teachers, and none of them ever discipline her in any significant way. And if this had been in the 80s in America, she would have been sent to the office and she would have gotten licks. Like, she would have been, like, corporal punishment would have happened.
Oh wow.
For sure, that we called it getting licks, and she would have been getting like 3 to 5 licks every time she did that stuff. Like, and so I started looking up corporal punishment and like, what are the rules about that? And I think it's still legal in the States. Like, whether it's implemented on a state by state basis, I think it varies, but certain states, I think, including the one I live in, it's still a thing that can happen. Which is shocking to me considering how lawsuit friendly everyone is here. But I can't imagine that anyone would react well to someone just spanking their child.
No.
But I'm saying legally on the books, it is a thing that can still happen, and definitely happened all the way through when I was in high school in the early to mid 90s, because I got licks in the 90s.
Wow. So when you say lick, I'm just to be clear for for a UK audience, you're not actually being licked.
No, that's a whole different punishment. But this is like, they had paddles. They were like big pieces of wood. A lot of times the principal would hang it on the wall behind his desk in his office as a threat. And sometimes they would have names of like the destroyer, like printed on the paddle. Some of times they would have holes in them for like air holes to like make them hit harder, and they would basically make you put your hands on a desk, and they would walk up behind you and hit your butt with this piece of wood like however many times.
And you learned what from that?
Not to get caught.
Okay, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good lesson.
That's mostly what I learned with all of the punishments, including suspension, detention, that I got.
Yeah.
Not that I got all of them, but I did get all of them.
Yeah, see, I was never in detention. I never got any punishment. I was the straight A student, goody two shoes. That's not to say
Wow.
I didn't do things. I
You
did
were
do
just better at
things.
not getting caught, so you didn't need to learn that lesson like I did.
Yeah, I was just an evil sociopath who didn't get caught. But um, yeah, no, I don't think corporal punishment was a thing when I was at school at all.
Mm.
I think it had been outlawed in England, certainly. I'm not sure about Scotland and Wales, but definitely in England. I
I think
don't
I looked it up,
remember.
and it was, like, outlawed in the '80s, sometime in the '80s in England
Right.
or in the
Yeah.
UK.
It was never part of my experience of going to school at all.
Oh, it was 100%. I remember my principal in elementary school, like early on. He had this. He was this big, imposing, mean-looking man, and he had the paddle that hung behind his desk. And I was mortified. I was terrified of ever getting in trouble for fear he would hit
Wow.
me with that thing. It
Yeah, I
was
can
terrifying.
imagine.
So yeah.
Yeah. No, we got rid of the idea that you can motivate kids by beating them pretty quickly. I think it still went on in public schools. For some reason, parents would pay an absolute fortune for their kids to be beaten by perverts.
Okay. I mean, that makes sense.
And they end up in government, so this is great.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't know how Canada's. I would always, because I always think of Canada as being so nice. I don't know if they had corporal punishment at this point in time. I certainly don't think it's ever represented. It's not on Degrassi, but it's definitely part of, at least where I grew up, both in, more so in the South. I don't think they did it as much in Alaska, but definitely in Alabama, they were all about corporal punishment
Wow.
down here in the South. So
I imagine in Canada they just get their poutine taken away.
Could be.
Could be.
Well, so were there any other key storylines that you thought were outstanding that you wanted to sort of talk through or point out?
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the most famous storyline in the series that I watched, and certainly the one that I think most kids remember when they remember Grange Hill, which is Zamo Maguire's heroin addiction, which plays out in series 9. That's the reason why I watched it. Yes, heroin addiction. It's pretty hardcore.
Yeah.
So it took Grange Hill's usual approach of trying to show a more nuanced and sophisticated story than the story that kids were generally being told at that time, which is that if you take drugs, you will die, and that is it. Which, of course, just didn't accord with kids' genuine experiences of dabbling in drugs if they did do so. Instead, what they showed is sort of long-term consequences of his actions. So he was losing credibility with his friends because he kept borrowing money from them and not giving it back. He was lying about what he was using it for. He was neglecting his friendships and his relationship with his girlfriend Jackie. He eventually starts to steal things from his own house and from his friends' houses, to pawn them in order to get money for his habit, which has real consequences for his friends, especially when he steals his friend Rolly's alarm clock, and as a result, Rolly missed his French oral exam. At one point, he steals the school VCR and gets in trouble with the police. His friends are trying to figure out how to help him. They're asking for opinions from adults, but also always posing them as hypotheticals without saying that they actually know someone that's having this issue. Eventually, he gets caught. We see him struggling with withdrawal. At one point, he claims he's kicked the habit, but we find out that he's still taking and he's hiding the drugs in a bathroom at school. And eventually it just ends up being really humiliating for him. He ends up fighting with his girlfriend over a packet of heroin and gets arrested whilst trying to lick it off the floor. So it really does just sort of show how how being taken over by this need is just completely debilitating and humiliating and awful for him. And eventually he he ends up in an NHS rehab center, crying whilst thinking about all the things, the damage that he's done to his friends and his family. And it finishes with him sort of crying, looking out of a rain-spattered window, which just made me think of Joey and Friends for some reason.
Oh my God, you're right.
Yeah, it absolutely. It
really
does. It
Oh,
really is
dear.
that. So yeah, it's sort of, instead of drugs equals death, you'll end up on the streets prostituting yourself. It was instead, look, this is just really harmful for your life. It's going to impact all of your friends. It's going to really disappoint everyone, and make everybody's lives difficult. So it was a more realistic and useful
Right.
example for kids to watch, and one that they could actually relate to. The storyline became so popular that the kids the kids recorded a song
I think I know where you're going with this.
called Just Say No.
Oh God.
Yeah, the music video features lots of wearing headphones and
It's very
clutching
We Are
them.
the World, isn't it?
It really is, and there's a whole saxophone solo, and and all of a sudden there's a lot of dancing in leotards, and I have no idea why there's dancing in leotards going on.
My gosh.
It's the 80s, I guess. So
What
that
is
just
this? I feel like I'm watching that episode of Next Generation with Beverly Crusher, just like crushing it in her leotard. Do you remember that? It's so gratuitous. It's like, oh my God, what are we doing?
Yes, but
These are children.
These are children. Yeah, they're in leotards dancing. But for some reason, this got to number 5 in the UK charts. Obviously, we cannot play it on this podcast because copyright strike again. But if you just imagine like a mid-80s Stock Aitken Waterman produced thing sung by non-professional children.
Go look it up on YouTube. You will be amused.
You will be amused. It's awful, but not awful enough to turn off the the White House, as it turned out, because Nancy Reagan caught wind of their efforts and was
Well, I'm
so
sure she was
pleased.
elated to hear that her message of just the perfect solution to drug addiction had made its way across the pond. And now everyone can benefit from that knowledge of all you have to do is just say no.
You can just say no, and the problem is solved. So that resulted in the just mind-bending children's TV White House crossover event of the decade, which is the cast of Grange Hill having a sit-down with Nancy Reagan, where they talked about drug issues.
Wow.
And eventually presented her with a 12-inch remix copy of their single, which
I'm sure she listened to it often.
I'm sure she was frequently donning a leotard and leaping about listening to that.
I'm going to envision her putting on a leotard in that very room with that amazing neon yellow couch and just, aerobicizing till her heart's content. Wow.
Absolutely.
That is stunning, Conrad. Really.
Yep. So there is an apocryphal story that the actor who played Rolly, Zammo's best friend, played by Erkan Mustafa, there's an apocryphal story that he smoked a joint while he was there and was high throughout the entire experience.
I want to believe it's true so much.
Everybody wanted to believe it's true. It's not true. He has admitted it wasn't true. He just used to say that because he got bored of being asked questions about the experience, and he genuinely couldn't remember it because it was 30 years ago and it really didn't make that much of an impression on him. So he just used to make stories up like Robert Pattinson in interviews for Twilight. So
those are funny as well. Like if you haven't seen Robert Pattinson talking about anything to do with the Twilight movie filming, it is pretty hilarious because he is not a fan.
No, and he's just lying all the time. He's admitted recently that absolutely nothing he said in those interviews is true.
He's also gone off about how stupid he thinks the plot line is, and it is funny to listen to him. If you're a fan of the movies, or the books at all, you might not want to watch it because it might kill it for you. But I found it to be terribly funny.
So there you go. That's the Just Say No Drug story from Grange Hill Series 9.
Amazing.
But it does have to be said, they covered a very serious issue in a very accessible way, and a way that was relatable and useful for kids of that age watching it, which is amazing.
And they do a thing in the season or the series where you see that like he's dating his girlfriend and he's starting to act weird and he's starting to do these things, but you don't know why. And it's just sort of like this through line that builds over several episodes until finally you figure out what is going on with him. But like he's selling off stuff that he loves. And
you don't know why.
Becoming more withdrawn. And it's sort of a slow burn, right? Like it doesn't just like one episode all of a sudden, which in Degrassi, it would be like one episode all of a sudden this character would be having this issue. And then it would kind of be dealt with sort of when the repercussions may sort of be in the background in subsequent episodes. That's how Degrassi would do it. So I'll give you an example. So the very first episode of Degrassi is focused on a character named Stephanie K. She, over the summer, has sort of become like, I don't know if her boobs grew or what happened, but she feels like she looks older and she wants to dress more sexy, more adult, more mature, whatever. But her mother won't let her. And her parents also just got divorced. So she's living with her mom. She doesn't have a lot of parental oversight. And so she's doing this thing where she packs her cool clothes, her sexy clothes in her book bag. And she comes to school very frumpy, goes to the bathroom. She comes early and then she puts on all this makeup, teases her hair up, wears really low cut halter tops and things that would never be allowed in an American school. I don't know what's going on in Canada if you guys were allowed to dress that way, but we couldn't even wear spaghetti straps in our schools. So she's wearing like a halter top with like nothing, like her shoulders and back are bare. And I'm just like, she's 13 years old. Oh my God. Yeah, it's upsetting. But anyway, so she's walking and watching like the male characters, like Joey, who is like Joey Jeremiah is like this really big main sort of guy character. And he's sort of a lot of times the comic relief and stuff, but he's constantly like flirting with Stephanie because she looks all sexy. And she starts running for student body president. And of course, she's popular with the boys. And so she starts using that to her advantage by saying, I'll give you a kiss if you vote for me.
Oh.
So she stands out on the front steps of the school and starts giving out kisses for votes.
That's not good.
Her friend, right. And so, and it's again, challenging to watch because these are all children. It's not like tongue kissing or anything, but it's still kind of like, ooh. But yeah, and so like over the course of the entire 3 years of the show, you see her sort of evolve and like she sort of keeps doing that. Like it's in the background. Like you'll literally just see her in the background of shots, like walking around wearing either frumpy or very revealing clothing. And, you know, she sort of talks about it occasionally, like she and her best friend have a big falling out over it. And so again, it's like, that's the key episode about it, but you see it for 3 years. It continues to just be part of who she is and her whole character's storyline. So I wanted to come back really quickly to the drug thing, because I think what you're saying about, aside from the Just Say No song, I feel like Grange Hill does a really good job of that, showing that drugs are a little more nuanced, because in Degrassi, the big hard drug that they show, which there aren't a lot, I think they allude, I think in Degrassi High, they show someone smoking pot. But in Degrassi Junior High, there's a whole plot line around Shane, who is the father of Spike's baby. So he's the dad in the teen pregnancy plot line. And he goes to a concert and he does LSD and then he disappears. and then like no one can find him. He doesn't literally disappear, and he may have thought he did, but then apparently he jumped or fell off of a bridge, and we never really learn
Oh.
exactly what happened. But he doesn't die, and then eventually he has long-term like brain damage and physical like problems from his fall, because it was a very long fall. And so that is like the very first time he does drugs, he suffers this massive consequence. Sort of like Spike, the very first time she has sex, she gets pregnant.
Right.
And that's
Yeah.
discussed. It's like, well, you can't get pregnant the first time, which was always a plot line that they talk about. And I always felt like it was a plot line because they wanted to show that the character wasn't a slut, so to speak. That
Yeah.
it was just like a one-time mistake, as opposed to like a systemic thing that this person was doing that then led to whatever. But I mean, you can make all kinds of judgments about it, but I mean, they did show it. At least they showed something. Although I do think it was very much in the line of just say no and scaremongering about drugs, as opposed to a more realistic approach, which would be you can do drugs and you may not necessarily get caught, but there will be repercussions in different parts of your life.
Yeah, in all kinds of different ways. The interesting thing I noticed revisiting this series of Grange Hill is that there's a parallel plot line going on that's all about smoking. The kids are smoking, the teachers are smoking, obviously, in the
Yes.
staff room. You see, I think the first time you're introduced to Danny Kendall, he's having a fag.
Oh,
which is
absolutely.
one of the pupils. Yeah, so it's rife. And at one point during the series, they actually start running a campaign to get people to quit smoking because they realize that it's just not good and that secondhand smoke is not good for them. And some of the kids and some of the teachers are shown to be struggling with it. So there is this parallel story going on about drug addiction, and at one point they explicitly, when Zamo's story is coming to a climax, they explicitly make the connection. One of the characters says, "I'm not addicted to any drugs," and the teacher says, well, "What about your cigarettes?" It's Danny Kendall actually says, "What about the cigarettes?" And so, and interestingly in that, the parent-teacher, the governors' association again, they ban the tracking of this anti-smoking campaign in the school fanzine, they call it,
Yes.
the school magazine, because they just don't want to present the fact that kids are smoking. They would
Yes.
rather hide that than actually deal with it. So it gives another story to another example to kids that parents are, the parents are just trying to hide the problems, whereas the kids actually want to deal with them and confront them. Which again, in 1986, this is an amazing thing to present in a popular show.
There's an amazing parallel to Degrassi there with Spike's pregnancy as she starts getting more visible in her pregnancy, and she starts showing, so to speak. The parents band together and want to get her kicked out of the school, like make her so that she has to do homeschooling or go to some alternative school rather than be there because she's a bad influence, even though everybody at the school already knows she's pregnant. Like, it's super well known. And then, and they're like, oh, well, why doesn't the Shane character, the dad, why doesn't he have any repercussions? Just because he's not showing, he gets to keep going to school and being normal like everybody else. And so the school board meets and decides that Spike has to leave and can't come to school anymore. And Stephanie K, I think it's Stephanie. No, it's a different character, but she puts it in the newspaper. She puts it in the school paper, like, which she gets in huge trouble for doing, like that.
Right.
She's trying to like stir up the kids to go to this and get their parents to go to the school board meeting to speak on behalf of Spike. And but yeah, it is sort of like parents trying to suppress, and the kids are all talking about it in the hallways going, well, that's just stupid. Why are they punishing her now? Like, she's already been pregnant for months. Like, this is old news. Like, so what?
Yeah, exactly. It makes it come alive for the kids to represent this kind of hypocrisy and narrow-mindedness, and that as with everything, it's the parents that are shocked by things that their kids are watching. The kids are fine. It's not an issue. at all. One thing I should clarify, when I said that somebody's having a fag, I'm talking about cigarettes. Sorry,
I
that's
think that Americans know that, but yes, that I knew that's what you meant, so I didn't.
no, good to point that out. Yes. Yeah.
Well, so one of the other things that I feel like I have to say before we end, because I did allude to it at the beginning, is I know I mentioned Wheels, who was played by the actor Neil Hope. So as I said, the original Degrassi series was not using union actors. So they were non-union productions. And its cast were no longer paid regularly when it ended in the 90s. Now, I don't know what the standard would have been for any other like had they been union, I don't know if they would have gotten paid then either. But this does come up because he passed away in 2007 and he struggled with having enough money and all of that kind of stuff. He had mentioned in interviews that happened later on that it would have been really helpful had he been getting any royalties from these shows, which were at that time still in reruns all over the world. And you would think that, to some degree, they could have been getting some amount of like a paycheck from that, which would have been helpful for him. So I'm a huge fan of Neil, and I think it's so tragic what happened to him. And I actually met one of our Retro Blasting supporters, Jeff, shout out to Jeff, on a Neil Hope fan group where he has a whole fan group where a lot of people still share all kinds of great information about some of the stuff he did. So yeah, I mean, it's just unfortunate, but I think again, people had good intentions in making these shows. I think overall, I think it was good.
Yeah. On a similar note, it's worth mentioning that the actor who played Ziggy Greaves, the Liverpudlian that we talked about earlier, George Christopher, or George Wilson, as he's known, he's also struggled with mental health issues. And it's kind of interesting. I've got a couple of clips from him. One that was him at the time when he was shooting Grange Hill, and one of him as an adult talking about the effect that his unrealistic expectations of what was going to happen to him as a result of being on the show. Again, not necessarily in terms of royalties, but in terms of an ongoing career. So I've got a clip here where there's a couple of kids that are talking about how it affected their schoolwork, and then George Christopher talking about how he wasn't particularly worried about that issue.
My schoolwork dropped quite a lot. It just went slowly downhill.
I think you can always go back to your education. Once you finish Grange Hill, I mean, I can go back and take some more O-levels if I wanted. I can go on and do A-levels. But, I mean, you get too old for Grange Hill. I mean, if I hadn't got it 3 years ago, I would never have really got a part, I don't think.
I think in acting you don't really need examinations, If a director or whatever likes you, he's not going to turn you down because you haven't got an A-level, is he? That's the way I look at it. Take me for what I am, not how clever I am. Sometimes it's like being an animal in a cage, all these girls screaming at you, like looking at you.
When I come out of Grange Hill, I thought it was going to be like Brad Pitt. I thought I was going to walk into Hollywood, once upon a time in Hollywood. That's what I thought it was going to all be, because that's what I just kind of knew the last 4 or 5 years. But it wasn't to be, and I realised it wasn't to be, and I had to work normal jobs. It was hard, and I say my nan passed away. All these things are built up, and it eventually came to a climax. I was imagining so many things. I won't even go into it because there's so many, and I just lost it totally.
Yeah, so he had a lot of issues. He witnessed the Hillsborough disaster as well in 1989, which is a fatal human crush incident during a football match at Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield. Wow. This and other factors contributed towards his issues with mental health, and also self-harming incidents. Eventually he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder in 2011, and he has been doing better in recent years because he has medication that helps keep him on an even keel. But yes, the kids, maybe some of the kids just had a completely incorrect assumption about what was going to happen to them as a result of being on the show.
Right.
And yeah, it didn't really pan out for most of them, in fact, except Todd Carty really is one of the few that really had an ongoing career.
Yeah, well, I mean, I know that some of the actors, like I think at least 3 of them, became major players on Degrassi: The Next Generation. So that started in the aughts, I believe, and continued on for many, many years. It's not on now, but it was on for much longer than Degrassi Junior High. And so I think it went through like 2016 or something like that. And I've definitely watched a lot of that show as well, and it's very good. I think Drake was a big person that came out of that show, and also like the Clerks guys. So Jason Mewes and Kevin Smith, big fans of Degrassi. I guess they're Canadian, so that kind of makes sense. But like I think they've even made appearances on Degrassi: The Next Generation. So whether you like them or not, whatever, but Degrassi has become a huge thing now. It didn't seem to be as big of a thing in the 80s in America. So I know it was big in Canada and in Alaska where I was, but I can't speak to the rest of the country. But I do think that these shows, because they were willing to sort of venture into these areas, and kids really did respond and watch, even though a lot of the shows that came out of this were things like Saved by the Bell or, on the one end, and things like Beverly Hills 90210, and then Buffy, and then Veronica Mars, and, Roswell, and all of these bazillion high school level TV shows that I know and love, let's be honest. I think they owe a lot in terms of like getting a footing and getting the money to be produced. It comes from these types of shows.
Yeah, absolutely. You can clearly see the line from this to Netflix shows like Sex Education and Heartstopper. They're clearly standing on the shoulders of the achievements of these shows from the late 70s and early 80s, for sure.
Absolutely. And for me, one of the big benefits of even doing this episode of Dreamland is that I bought this. It's a school bus shaped container that holds like not all, but like a lovely selection of after school specials on DVD. And I look forward to finding ways to either talking about those episodes or using clips from those episodes, because they are gold. They are cinematic gold. They're hilarious. They're informative. They're just wonderful.
And don't they have like early examples from the careers of very prominent Hollywood A-list
100%.
actors?
Like Jodie Foster is in like this one I watched from, I believe it was 74, and she is so far above everyone else in that episode. The episode is about, she's a baseball player and she's female, so that's a problem. And so it's like all the people in town reacting and yelling at her, including adults, as she's going up and just trying to be a pinch hitter for this team whose player got injured. And she's a really good player, but because she's a girl, everyone's like, you shouldn't be doing that. That's wrong. And heckling her and bullying her. And she's very good in it because she's Jodie Foster. But you can see why she became a star when you see it. But I mean, it's the 70s. Boy, is it the 70s. So,
yeah,
if you get a chance, go check that one out. It's on YouTube right now. I don't know how long it will be. So, any other last thoughts before we end our episode?
No, except it's been an absolute blast to expose you to Grange Hill. I hope everybody enjoyed it.
I really loved it. I could have continued watching it, although I would strongly have benefited from subtitles. But unfortunately, It's not on any streaming services here. So I hear Michael coming downstairs. Hopefully there's not another audio problem. Yes, dear? Hello? Yes. Thank you. Super chats. Let me read the few super chats we've got. Sorry. Jason Anderson, he says early super chat to support Dreamland and to wish the Curbs a healthy recovery. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Chazilla says, so happy for the return of Dreamland. I appreciate that as well. Let me just show these really quickly for those who, there's Jason's and Chazilla. Brian Dillingham just sends $2. Thank you so much. Appreciate you, Brian. Carl says, for my love of the Dreamland podcast. Thank you. Wicked Person says, thank you for not simply putting Aaron under Conrad's face and just referring to him as Aaron and saying he's 15. Yeah, no. No, definitely not doing that. And then Analog Toys, thank you, Tony, says, it's been a pleasure to listen to the two of you on this beautiful morning down under. And we are so pleased that you were able to join us, Tony. That does wrap up this episode of Dreamland. We are having an after show stream right after this over on Patreon. So for just $1, you can join the Retro Blasting Patreon and have your questions answered live and get the inside scoop on our exhaustive research. I know there's probably a ton of stuff. I know I have a ton of stuff that I didn't get to. You can also find our show notes with links to all of our sources at retroblasting.com/dreamland. We will be back in January with our next show. Conrad, what is the title for our next episode?
Our next episode is titled Beans.
Ah, beans.
Beans.
Frijoles.
Oh, yes.
So until then, you can follow me and Conrad on Retroblasting and Movie Oubliette, respectively, on all social media outlets. And you can email us at thedreamlandpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.